My name is Ben Higgins. I am from Warsaw, Indiana, but I currently live in Denver, Colorado. And I'm probably best known for being the Bachelor on ABC's The Bachelor. My life started with me feeling like an outsider, and I lived that narrative for a lot of my life. And I tried to satisfy that story and validate that story with many different things. If it was addictions, if it was relationships, if it was physical connection, if it was being famous. I was a business analyst, and I worked this job for a year, and at one point, the chief marketing officer came up to me and said, "Ben, you don't like your job, you work all the time, you have no friends, you're not dating, and you're in your mid-20s in this new city. There's this show that is taking applications that I want to sign you up for if you would say yes to going on." And I asked what show, and she said The Bachelorette. And all of a sudden I find myself in these interviews with all these producers asking me all these questions about me and my story. And came back home 2 days later, they called and said, "We want you on the show." And that started, still to this day, probably the most impactful and the most unexpected thing in my life. I went the first couple of weeks without really talking much. I could get along with people, I could say the right thing at the right moment, but the more people got to know me, I thought still the less they would like me. One of the producers, a good friend of mine today, somebody I love dearly, came up to me and said the one thing that would probably hurt me the most. But he said, "Ben, I don't like you." And I said, "Why don't you like me?" And he says, "Because you don't let me get to know you. In fact, you don't let anybody get to know you." And he goes, "I actually have a feeling that nobody in your life knows you." And I ended up over 3 hours kind of breaking down to him for the first time in my life, putting words to this feeling I had felt since the second grade and saying, "You're right, I feel unlikable," or "I feel unlovable. I feel like the more I let people into my life, the more they'd want to push away from my life." The episode aired, and they showed the whole thing. And then it also showed me telling the Bachelorette at the time, Caitlin, that I feel unlovable. And I was embarrassed, I was ashamed, and I was so scared. Because it was the most vulnerable I'd ever been in my life. And now it's airing on national television in front of 12 million people. And I woke up the next morning to thousands of messages saying I feel the same way. That, people saying they've never been able to put words to it, or they never knew anybody else felt this way. Like, I don't have to be ashamed of the struggle I have. That actually, when I started to speak the struggle out loud, the less alone I felt. And so one day, about a month and a half after filming The Bachelorette, I got a phone call and they asked if I would want to be the Bachelor. I think a lot of this desire to be famous is really a desire to be known, because fame in itself is very unfulfilling. It's only when I started to use my influence for something greater than myself that any type of fulfillment ever came in. I know that there's a temporary enthusiasm and euphoria to it, but that fades, and once that fades, there's nothing, let me tell you, there is nothing left standing. It's only when I started to use my influence or to use my connections for something greater than myself that any type of fulfillment ever came in. A truth that I believe exists across everybody is that our pains actually can connect us. That our pains and the things that we feel and that we're pushing way down that we don't want to communicate or we don't want to tell anybody about might be the thing that connects us both to everybody else. If you're experiencing a pain that is suffocating, demoralizing, that makes you feel alone or paralyzing at some level, making you feel like you can't even get up from the bed to walk out of your room, just know that you're not alone. I have this really strong belief that if you have breath on this earth, you have value, and that as humans, we need each other. We want to know each other, we want to love each other. We are made for connection. We were made to enter into our lives through the goods and through the bads. And we need you to speak, we need you to share. When I started sharing, my whole world opened up to something new, to find that safe space, to find that confidant, to just sit with somebody and to tell them where you're at, because who knows where those conversations goes. Maybe they might look back at you and say, I feel the same way too.